When did you first start editing your stimming? Did you get to an age where either consciously or subconsciously you adopted stims that were less obvious but also maybe less effective? If you did reduce or change your stimming as you got older, did that change coincide with a drop in your mental health? I've spoken about it before, but I think I must have been really young when I first started suppressing the urge to stim. Until I was 3 years old, I was at home with my mom. My stimming was always seen as quirky and creative and unique, and everybody in my life knew about it and nobody minded it. Everyone would let me flap away, even if that meant I would be kind of lost in my own world sometimes and I wouldn't always respond when spoken to. When I started going to nursery for a few days, it was quite a big shock to me. I had this overwhelming feeling of just not knowing what I was supposed to do and not knowing how everyone else around me seemed to know exactly what to do. We were told quite sternly that we needed to cross our legs when we were sitting on the carpet, and I didn't know how to cross my legs. I would find a spot at the back of the group and I would sit with my legs stretched out in front of me and my little heart would be beating and I'd just be hoping that somebody wouldn't call me out on the fact that I wasn't sitting correctly, because I just had no idea. How does one cross their legs? And how did everybody else know how to do it? And as you might guess, I wasn't particularly good at socializing with the other children. I've been fine with my cousins who came around to play a lot. The one-on-one or like small group interactions with people who knew me really well were fine, but this big group of strangers running around screaming was something else entirely. I remember this one time when they were playing with one of those parachute things where all the children stand around it and they lift it up and they roll balls around on top of it and they crawl underneath it and all that stuff. And I remember just walking around on my own. I would just walk around the perimeter of the playground and I assume I flapped my hands because I was lost in my own world, and usually when I was lost in my own world like that, I was flapping my hands. And I felt like I was watching the children and the staff members who were playing from behind a sheet of glass. Everyone just left me to it. I suppose at 3 years old, I was young enough to be allowed to do things that were a little bit strange. Maybe it was just seen as me being happy and kind of in a daydream or something, which it basically was. Stimming takes me out of myself. It makes me feel warm and floaty. It helps me to think of ideas, and when I was at that nursery, it helped me to vividly imagine that I was somewhere else. That image of my lonely stimming on the sidelines is kind of sad, and I do wonder why on earth the staff members didn't notice me. I never remember anybody asking me if I was okay or even attempting to try and get me to integrate more with the group or to help me to interact with anybody at any point. But worse than being ignored and left to it would have been to be told to stop stimming, to be wrenched out of that safe world and be forced to hold that parachute. At some point between the age of 3 and 7, I stopped stimming in public like that. I probably became conscious that the people around me weren't doing it. I also had moments like this one time that I've spoken about before where I was reading a book. It was supposed to be quiet reading time, and my friend was like, "You've been doing this," and she did an imitation of me, and apparently I'd been lifting the book and flapping the book, and I'd also been standing off my chair a little bit. That was quite surprising to me because in my head I'd just been completely immersed in the story and I could picture the book being flat on the desk. I had no idea I had been doing that, but I knew it was something that I did, so she wasn't lying. At that point, I must have already been making a conscious effort to not flap my hands, to not stim in front of other people, because that felt like a failure, like I'd slipped up somehow, and I had this horrible sinking dread. So these immersive, big, full body movements that I used to do as a child and the hand flapping fell away. Instead, I would write words sometimes subtly in the air by my side if I was feeling particularly anxious, and I'd flick my fingers underneath my cardigan sleeves. I probably did other things that people found weird because that was a very popular adjective used to describe me by other children, but I was trying my best not to do those things. And this whole trying my best thing did coincide with a shift in my well-being. I felt heavy and tired all the time as a child. For as long as I can remember, I've had a kind of sense of doom weighing on me, which now I know to be a symptom of anxiety. I had thoughts that seemed like completely inappropriate for somebody that young, of like, what am I doing here and what is the point? As I got older, I would act out more at home when I was told to do things like go to bed on time in order to attempt, which it didn't really work out, but attempt to stop myself from appearing weird. I think I held myself very still at school. When I think of school, it always felt like being in a straitjacket. It was the beginning of me masking by being aware of every single movement, and I had this horrible constant awareness of my hands. And over time I started to reduce my stimming at home too, even though that was my safe place and even though nobody would have judged me. But I started to stick to more kind of socially acceptable stims like dancing. I moved from hand flapping to flapping objects. I don't know if that was because it seemed more subtle or if I just decided I preferred that. I never stopped doing that. I've always done that through my whole life and I still do it, but I started doing it just when nobody was in the room, going into a different room to do it. The older I got, the more embarrassed and kind of irritated I'd get if somebody caught me. In general, I just wasn't a happy young person, and it doesn't seem to just be me. Apparently 70% of autistic children have at least one mental health condition, which is pretty horrible to read, and 40% have 2 or more. It's just horrible. I mean, it's supposed to be rainbows and unicorns. It's supposed to be the best time of your life. Everybody says they always want to go back. I certainly can't relate to that. So in trying to answer the question of why are we so mentally ill as children, I stumbled upon this article from September. The article stated that autistic children may start to experience mental health difficulties such as anxiety between the ages of 6 and 11, which definitely reflects my own experience, so I was very intrigued. The article was based on a study also published in 2023. This study followed 75 children from the ages 2 to 3 to adolescence. As is pretty standard for a lot of autism research, only 15 of the people involved in the study out of 75 were born female. The study found that changes in both social difficulties and also restrictive repetitive behavior, which is kind of the umbrella that stimming falls under when you are diagnosing autism, seem to be directly linked to changes in mental health difficulties, particularly anxiety, but not in the way they'd expected, and in a way that really suggests that the attitudes that a lot of experts hold about autism are really dangerous and based on a lot of terrible research and projects from the 20th century that we really kind of need to move on from. The researchers had correctly hypothesized that an increase in social communication issues would lead to more mental health and behavior challenges, which I think makes sense. And I'm sure a lot of people watching this video unfortunately have experienced what it's like to be ostracized by your peers. The thing that the researchers were completely off about was the link between restrictive and repetitive behaviors, RRB, including stimming, and mental health. The hypothesis they put forward was that basically any increase in autism symptoms, as they worded it, the severity of the autism symptoms of a child, would also be linked to an increase in mental health difficulties and behavior challenges. And they also thought the opposite would be true as well. Any decrease in the severity of autism symptoms, in how autistic somebody appeared, would lead to a decrease in mental health difficulties, and that child would be more mentally well. The more neurotypical they seemed, the less mental health issues they'd have. But would you assume that a child who stimmed more would be more likely to be mentally ill? You might be able to think of times when you felt more anxious and more overwhelmed by your environment and therefore you've stimmed more. So I suppose the researchers are kind of assuming that stimming and other restrictive repetitive behaviors, which includes things like kind of lining up toys and also special interests as well, they're assuming they're a symptom of distress, a sign of an autistic person who is not coping, a sign of an autistic person whose autism is more severe, which is obviously language that a lot of autistic people don't like. That was their hypothesis, but what did they actually find? They found that their restrictive and repetitive behavior decreasing severity group had elevated and increasing levels of anxiety. 94% of the children who decreased their restrictive repetitive behavior met the criteria for an anxiety disorder. And even the children who just stayed stable, they had the same amount of restrictive repetitive behavior as they grew up, had higher amounts of anxiety according to their parents' reports than the group of children who increased their amount of stimming as they got older. So basically, the more restrictive and repetitive behaviors a child showed as they got older, the less likely they were to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. It was the exact opposite of what they thought would happen. In the discussion, the authors talk about how some previous studies have found that restrictive repetitive behaviors are linked to higher levels of anxiety, but then they kind of pose the question of, well, what comes first? Are people stimming more because they're more anxious? anxious, or are people anxious because they're stimming more, which might sound like a bit of a weird question to ask for an autistic person. I don't feel like many of us would feel like our stimming causes us more anxiety. I suppose when you're looking at all restrictive and repetitive behaviors, you can end up sometimes with anxiety around your special interests. But even if that has been true for me in the past, I would never say that I'm a less anxious person if I don't have access to my special interests. They do state that previous research has linked restrictive and repetitive behaviors to experiencing positive emotions. When I flapped my hands as a child, I felt like so warm and floaty and euphoric. It allowed me to become completely immersed in what I was doing, and I'd step into these beautiful deep flow states where I was completely engrossed in whatever I was trying to focus on. When discussing their results, the authors say, "We found that a decrease in RRB severity during middle childhood was related to higher levels of anxiety in late childhood. This is contrary to our prediction that decreases in autism symptom severity would be associated with having less mental health symptoms. However, if RRB function is viewed as a strategy for anxiety reduction, then elimination of this form of expression could indeed lead to increased anxiety. This position has previously been suggested in 2017 that if individuals are unable to or choose not to perform RRB, their absence can lead to heightened anxiety levels. Increasingly, we found that children that increased in RRB severity had fewer mental health challenges. Our findings suggest that interventions focused on reducing RRB severity should be implemented cautiously." I'd venture to say that interventions shouldn't focus on reducing them at all unless those restrictive repetitive behaviors are causing the person harm. And even in those cases, it should be about finding a replacement, not about just stopping them and leaving the person with no coping mechanisms in a chaotic world. Personally, I can't imagine any autistic person would be better off if all of their, what people want to call restrictive and repetitive behaviors, were just erased or prohibited. But devastatingly, that is exactly what they used to do. I've had the pleasure, that's the sarcastic pleasure, of reading about Lovas's work recently. He was one of the early researchers involved in developing applied behavior analysis, ABA therapy, for autistic children. This work began in the mid-1960s, which Autism Speaks notes on their website as if this adds some sort of credibility. Look, we've been doing this since the 60s, it must be a good thing, right? But in 1965, the article Scream, Slaps and Love was published in Life magazine, which detailed how Lovas was using electric shocks within his treatment, in quotation marks, to discourage some behaviors, and it contains some pretty graphic images as well. So maybe we've been doing this since the 1960s is not quite the flex that Autism Speaks thinks it is. I don't know. What I've read of his work is absolutely appalling and dystopian. He conducted what was essentially extremely intensive autism conversion therapy for very young children. It would go on for years and take up most of their day. In a paper from a little bit later on in 1973, he lists self-stimulation and echolalia as two inappropriate behaviors that he managed to successfully decrease. He describes the children he worked with as being replete with interfering self-stimulatory behavior when they first arrived. He felt that some of these behaviors needed to be prevented because they were causing harm to the child or to other people, but also because he felt they interfered with the child's attention, and also because he could see no purpose to them. And this is a common theme that comes up even in studies today, which we'll get onto in a minute. In order to discourage stimming, staff members would ignore the children if they stimmed. They would maybe leave the room and leave them on their own, or they would put them in an isolated room on their own as kind of a punishment. If that didn't work, they might use a slap or a painful electric shock, and then behaviors that they thought were positive that they wanted to encourage, they would use rewards, and often these rewards were food. Many people would argue, and they do argue in my comment section, that ABA therapy has changed a lot since then, and it's definitely a topic that I want to explore more on this channel, like how much has it changed. But if I was a parent of an autistic child right now, I would be very wary of putting them anywhere near ABA therapy. Everything I've seen so far suggests that the methods are definitely less barbaric, but also that they still involve what the 1973 researchers called symbolic approval and disapproval. In this 1973 paper or any of his other work that I've had a look at, there's never any mention of the well-being of the children. Improving their well-being doesn't seem to be a goal at all, or even really a consideration. The best you could say is it's about improving their function, in quotation marks, table manners being a thing that he seems to like to go on about quite a lot. So I'm really glad we had our priorities straight back in the good old days. Take me back to the 1970s, where we don't have any of these silly snowflakes that we have now. This is a lovely quote from the 1973 paper. Throughout, there was an emphasis on making the children look as normal as possible, rewarding him for normal behavior and punishing his psychotic behavior, teaching him to please his parents and us, to be grateful for what we would do for him, to be afraid of us when we were angry and pleased when we were happy. Adults were in control. In short, we attempted to teach these children what parents of the middle-class Western world attempt to teach theirs. A few sentences later, he goes on to refer to these children as primitive psychotic children, and he outright states that his hope at this stage was that they would recover from autism. He speaks a lot about appropriate play and wanting to encourage appropriate play, and I've seen this in more recent studies as well. He wanted to discourage the use of toys within restrictive and repetitive behaviors, so if someone was using the toy but not in the way he thought that it should be played with, that would need to be punished and corrected. But then he also admits that it's kind of difficult to tell the difference between playing with something and stimming with something, which is interesting. I really wonder what he would have made of my playing. My playing was almost exclusively me flapping my hands or flapping objects. I would sometimes arrange my toys the way I wanted them to be. Like, say I was playing with a doll's house, I'd put the Barbies in chairs or on the bed or wherever I wanted them to be, and then I would flap my hands in front of the doll's house, or I would flap a doll. I liked flapping doll's head, and I would play out the scenes in my head. If I was playing on my own, if I was playing with other children, I would try and do what Lovaas calls appropriate play, for sure. But my preferred way to play, my default, was always to flap an object and either play a game that was completely imaginary and the whole thing just was in my head, or involved laying out my toys in a certain way and then imagining things in my head. I'm sure Lovaas would have cancelled my fun straight up. That would have been the end of that, sadly. Quite frankly, 50 years ago is too recent for my liking, but you may say, like, we've moved on from that now. Okay, let's not dwell on that. Surely we don't ask children to suppress their stimming and other repetitive behaviors anymore, but no, we do. There was a paper in 2017 aimed to identify evidence-based behavioral interventions used to decrease restrictive and repetitive behavior in children with autism. In this paper, stims are listed as a type of impairment. Impairments included along the continuum of RRBs may include stereotypical or repetitive motor movements, such as continuous jumping or spinning, repetitive use of objects, playing with only one toy for a prolonged length of time. Shock, horror. You can't play with the same toy. Why is this pathologized? I don't get it. Speech or speech sounds, repeating the same word or sound over a prolonged length of time, insistence on sameness, such as wanting to do things the same way, having difficulty with changes in routine, highly restricted interests, only talking about or playing with items related to the same topic or theme with little variance. So special interests are also pathologized, which is nice. Thank you. I really appreciate it. In this 2017 paper, they suggest that restrictive repetitive behaviors should be stopped because they could cause significant functional impairment, such as causing an individual to stand out by making them look or act differently, possibly leading to social stigmatization and social isolation. So basically, because other children might bully a child for flapping their hands, which is a completely harmless thing to do and potentially leads to an increase in well-being for that child, so it's a positive thing to do. But because other people might bully and stigmatize you for doing it, you must be labeled impaired and you must be fixed. We don't try to change the bully's behavior. We don't call them impaired. We don't tell them they have social deficits, as we do with autistic children. We don't encourage neurotypical children to stim more. Hey, look guys, it's fun. Like, come join us. It's a good time. No, instead we write a whole article about different ways that we could cure them. Decreasing RRB to enable functional behaviors is central to the occupational therapist's role with this population. Many interventions identified as effective for this impairment are based on their principles of applied behavior analysis, ABA. And in another quote that's eerily similar to Lovaas's attitudes, by repeatedly performing the same seemingly non-purposeful behaviors, these individuals often do not have the opportunity to learn more functional behaviors. And there was another study in September this year, which was really horrifying to me. It was called Reduction of Restrictive Repetitive Behavior by Environmental Enrichment, and it compares autistic children's stimming to the behaviors observed in animals in captivity, in zoos and aquariums and farms. Body rocking and swimming in repetitive patterns are generally considered signs of poor animal welfare. I don't know if anyone else finds the comparison of autistic people to animals in the year 2023 pretty alarming, but I certainly do. We've decided that autistic human stimming looks a bit like what distressed zoo animals do, so therefore it must be the same thing and serve the same purpose. And this is why we so desperately need autistic adults to be involved in research, in my opinion. So many of the studies that I've looked at talk about stimming seeming purposeless or allude to it being poorly understood, but autistic adults are right here and we're like kind of happy to explain to you how stimming feels and why we do it from our perspective if you would give us the chance. In 2021 there was a lovely paper in which autistic adults and also allistic, non-autistic adults were asked about their stimming behaviours, which was great. I'm happy to share the stimming love with neurotypical people as well. If anything, like, they might be missing out a bit. Just as an aside, an interesting note about the study is that they do include self-diagnosed autistic people in a separate category, and then they have officially diagnosed autistic people. The results, I'll put the table up on screen if you're feeling any imposter syndrome. The results are almost completely identical between those two groups. Some of the common themes that came up with it, stimming can be used for self-regulation, to express emotions, including positive emotions such as excitement. One of the surest ways you could get me to flap my hands as a child was to put me in front of a cat or a dog because it made me happy, it made me excited. I don't think zoo animals are pacing their cages or acting out because they think the humans tapping on the glass look really cute. I don't think that's the reason. Maybe we should just stop abusing animals as well. I don't know. They also identified stimming as something that's soothing in a world where sensory issues can cause negative emotions. There was a common theme of autistic individuals suppressing stims to be more socially acceptable and using substitute stims that were less obvious, but these substitute stims were also less effective, which is definitely true of my own life. I started pinching the skin on my neck as well somewhere in my middle childhood. I used to do it to my mom when I was like drinking a bottle or something. I suppose I couldn't be flapping my hands and drinking my bottle at the same time, so that was kind of a substitute stim there. Then later on in life I started doing it to myself when I was at school, particularly if I was thinking hard about something or if I was feeling anxious and overwhelmed. It was just a little subtle thing that I could do, and it's led to the skin on my neck being quite discoloured, I think, and I still do it today. It is certainly miles less effective. It's like mildly comforting. It is nowhere near the same as the type of stimming I used to do freely when I was a child. The study challenges the prevailing view, largely from studies in childhood, that stimming is a negative behaviour. Thank you, we needed that, we still need that. Can you believe how desperately we still need that in 2023? It's sad, and it seems like somewhere in middle childhood, whether or not you actually do undergo ABA therapy, it's like you get a sort of social ABA therapy. You might receive rejection if you stim, if you flap your hands, either from your peers or from your teachers or from your parents, and you may be praised for doing things that are seen as more normal, appearing less autistic. We're receiving what Lovaas called symbolic approval and disapproval from the people around us, from the world and the society around us. We learn that it's safest not to be ourselves if we want to avoid ostracism, and then we hurt our own mental health in the process. My son has a lovely little friend at school who is autistic, and they stim very freely, very obviously. It looks really sweet. I love to see it. It reminds me a lot of myself. The one day I went to sit next to my son on the sofa and I noticed he was sat there flapping his hands, and I was confused because I'd waited to see if he would be like me. I wasn't diagnosed at the time, so I didn't know what be like me meant, but I was like, is he gonna flap his hands? Because it was such a big thing that I did it as a child. He never did, and he is very much not like me. He's very much like my not autistic partner. They're like basically clones of each other. It's scary, not in terms of looks, but in terms of personality. So it was weird seeing it. I was like, oh, he was said it's because that's what his friend does. So he was imitating the autistic friend. And so I was like, found a video I had on my phone from when I was diagnosed. I was like, oh, I used to do that too when I was small, and I always am just really enthusiastic about, isn't it so sweet? And he refers to it as them dancing and things like that. And I've told him the word stimming, and I've said some people do it. It just makes them feel happy. It's just a nice thing to do. I've noticed, occasionally he'll do a little bit of rocking and like moving his arms and stuff like that. Obviously he's not doing it constantly, he's not autistic, he doesn't feel the urge to do that, but he is supportive of his friend doing it, and he admires them and likes them, so he kind of wants to imitate them. And that's the thing, like the imitation, if we can destigmatize this, can work both ways. And even if a neurotypical person doesn't want to stim, just being around people being themselves, everybody masks to some extent, particularly in situations like work and school where you don't feel completely comfortable to be yourself. Isn't it great if everybody feels like they can be more themselves? And if they're doing something that isn't hurting anyone, why shouldn't you just be allowed to do things, you know, to make yourself happier. Maybe in the future autistic children can grow up without thinking that the only way they can possibly thrive is by trying to learn how to be neurotypical. For me, that was extremely damaging, and I developed a horrible internal voice and internal monologue about how I was always failing and falling short, and why couldn't I just be like everybody else. Instead of calling things that we don't understand and we don't relate to impairments, maybe we can accept that being a happy, mentally well person might not look exactly the same for everyone, and that's okay. Just because you don't get something doesn't mean that it automatically needs fixing. You don't need to be so fearful of difference. Why are we still, at this point in human history, so scared of difference? If you are autistic or suspect you might be autistic, or you have autistic children, the best advice I think is to let yourself or let them be autistic. There's a page that I really like on the National Autistic Society about preventing burnout. Maybe try stimming a bit more, you know, you might want to start when you're at home, alone, privately. Try some bigger stims. There's lots of things on TikTok and YouTube with people showing stims that they like to do. If you remember what you did in childhood, then great. If not, try stuff, get some fidgets. Try letting yourself be autistic. It can be tricky to even know what that means when you've spent your whole life teaching yourself, performing your own ABA therapy on yourself to try and get you to behave in a not autistic way. There's a lot to undo, and I think it's just having patience with yourself and realizing that it will take time. The world made so many of us shrink before we were even old enough to realize what we were doing. There is still time to get back to ourselves. It's the very last day to join my Patreon if you'd like to receive a free snail badge, so I will leave the link down below. I also have a video where I talk through why I decided to start a Patreon and all the different things that you get for joining. I'll leave a link to that on screen. There is a Discord server in there, and it is an incredible group of people. But yes, you have until the end of the day to get your snail badge if you want one. I'll probably end up producing a few spares, so I'm sure I'll be fine to accept a few last minute stragglers as well if you feel like you've just missed it. If you haven't seen my video on monotropism, it's a theory of autism. It potentially explains a lot of different facets of autism, including why we stim. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye, stim freely, flap your hands, do excessive waving if you want to. Bye.